Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Beautifully Rare podcast. My name is Sam Bish, and I'm one of your co-hosts, along with my wife, Brynne Bish. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 things to know and do after a brain injury diagnosis. So to get things started today, where I kind of wanted to start, is Brynne, if you could please just give us a brief summary of the diagnosis, the injury. I know in episodes 3 and 4, we kind of talked about that with Killian, but for those listeners that, might have been a couple weeks since they've listened to him, can you just sum it up for us?
Yeah, there's always so much to unpack with Killian's story because it is so complex.
Yeah.
And so, like Sam said, we do a full recap of how he got his injury, what the neurologist kind of gave us.
The in-depth story.
Yeah, the in-depth, behind-the-scenes story.
And those episodes 3 and 4, those were, I think, about an hour and a half. So there's a lot of content there. Yeah. It's not like a quick listen.
We did that because throughout the show, we're really going to reference his story. So that's kind of why we did full in-depth.
Rather than talking about it in bits and pieces across multiple episodes, we're like, you know what? Let's just do a full episode or two. Well, it was going to be one episode.
Yeah. And then we were an hour and 45 minutes in.
And he wasn't even born yet. And we're like, okay.
It's a long one.
Anyway, Brynne, sum it up for us.
So recap. So Killian had his cardiac arrest. We got the diagnosis of having severe brain injury. And then we were kind of in the ICU. And the neurology team wasn't really giving us any good news. It was all like, for the first time, it was kind of everybody took a hands-off approach of like, they didn't want to say, if you do this, Killian will, regain this. Or they didn't, it wasn't like cardiology. It was like they didn't want to give us any outcome prediction.
Yeah.
Because frankly, they can't. I mean,
right.
What they told us is, they've seen kids with just a little bit of injury have severe impairment, and they've seen kids with a lot of injury have very mild impairment. And so, to their point, they can't really predict.
You can't really, give an accurate scale. I mean, to reiterate what you just said, like, we were so used to that black and white, like cardiology is. It's like, this is wrong. This is what we need to do. Boom, done.
This is how you fix it.
Yeah, and not saying that the neurologists that we encountered were doom and gloom, but it was very vague, very, very gray area, no direct answers. And in our experience talking to multiple nurses, multiple other families, that's a common theme. That's a trend. That's just kind of how they operate. So if you're in this space right now and you're also frustrated, just know you're not alone, and that's just kind of how things are. Yeah,
and I think the thing as a parent that we were like looking back really wanting to search for is, are things going to be okay? And they frankly can't give you that promise. We were really searching for, is there a possibility that it could be okay? And what will it take for us to get to that point?
Yeah.
That's really what we were searching for. And I think had we been very clear about what we were wanting, to know, I think they would have been able to provide us a little bit more guidance. But a lot of the advice that we're about to run down of like 3 things to know and 3 things to do would have been really helpful to hear in the moment, because it's not like you're saying everything's going to be fine. Killian's going to be fine. He'll be able to reclaim. We just wanted to know, is there a possibility that he could reclaim? And the answer is always yes.
Always. Yeah.
Always. And even neurologists will tell you, of course, there's a possibility that it could be okay. But based off of the injury that they were seeing, nobody wanted to even have that conversation, and give us false hope.
Yeah. The probably the best guess out of anybody would be a lot of bad news, which we did receive. But, there is that glimmer of hope, which is what we were kind of attempting to cling on to.
Yeah.
And we just wanted somebody to say, it is there. But with that synopsis or summary, I want to kind of roll into a couple different things here. But the first, I think, being, I want you, Brynne, to basically give us a list, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, but give us a list of the things that you feel parents should know about brain injury going into a diagnosis like this. Like, what are, let's say, 3 super important things that parents should know?
I think the first thing to know is that...
And again, sorry to cut you off. Yeah. This is a lot based off of our experience. Everything that, doctors have told us, our independent research. Again, we're not therapists. We're not neurologists, obviously. We're sitting here just as parents of a child with a brain injury and sharing our experience. So, take this for what you will, but these are things that we found and were told that were extremely helpful to us.
That's a good point. I think the first thing to know is what neuroplasticity is. So when we got the injury, nobody was really, shuttling this term around. Mm-hmm. But I had worked in neurology before as a coordinator, and so it was something that they talked about all the time.
Yeah.
And I knew fundamentally what it was. But I think that every parent, if nobody has told you about this, you need to explore and understand the term appropriately. And basically what neuroplasticity is it's a lot like any other injury. The brain injury is a lot like any other injury. It gets hurt. You had some function before it gets injured, and then you have to relearn how to regain that function. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with the brain. And neuroplasticity is basically the brain's ability to either relearn or learn entirely new how to do a function or task. For example, clap or wave or what the color red is, or that person is mama and dada. Mm-hmm. And it's the brain's ability to literally work around its injury to establish new synapses that have the effect of learning it for the first time. And there is a couple, there's a couple of things that I think you can go into, Sam, so I'll kick it back to you. But we learned about this, and we learned what the term was. But then the next question we had was, well, what does that mean for Killian at his age? I mean, he's a baby. He didn't really, he wasn't really sitting up on his own. He wasn't really rolling. He was rolling over, but he wasn't walking. He wasn't feeding himself.
Such a young age that,
So what does that mean how does neuroplasticity apply to what we were seeing now of he was basically net new. He was basically functioning as a brand new infant who didn't know anything. So we had lost 7 months of, normal developmental progress. How can neuroplasticity help? So I guess the next question, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I was going to say based off that, I mean, I feel like in a way you kind of answered it, but the younger you are, and this is again the common theme that everybody was telling us, the younger a patient is when they experience a brain injury like this, the better it is. So they kept emphasizing, it's better that this happened. Obviously nobody wants their child to go through this, but it's better that it happened when he was at such a young age before learning how to do a lot of these things, because his brain hadn't quite mapped those neural pathways on how to, do certain things. Like you mentioned, he was kind of rolling over on his own. He loved his bouncer so much. Loved jumping. He was in those early stages of beginning to learn how to sit on his own. But it wasn't fully mapped. It wasn't like he knew how to do this, like it was, second nature type thing. So the fact that it did happen when he was so young was actually a benefit. It really worked in his favor. So that, again, that was one thing that they really harped on. I don't know if you want to elaborate any more, but
I think outside of this example, like a perfect example of what neuroplasticity is like children who are born without limbs. They find a way to eat on their own. They find a way to drive. They find a way to do all of what people are doing with all of their limbs. That's neuroplasticity in its like prime form. Like they never had the option of learning how to eat with two hands. So they've learned to eat with whatever they were given. It's the same kind of example. Like, this injury took place and he might struggle. His injury might prevent him from learning how to walk a certain way, but we can teach the brain to learn how to walk a different way. And so that's essentially what neuroplasticity is. And so the second point you kind of talked about, which is the younger the injury. Now there is a study, I'll have to find it and put it in the notes, but there was a study that talked about, that injuries that have taken place before a learned activity, exactly what you said, before a learned activity is the best outcome because they can learn, they can learn for the first time how to do it.
But it's not like they're relearning and having to remap pathways. They're mapping just the pathway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same study found that if the task was there beforehand, it's not impossible for them to relearn it. It will be more challenging, but it's not impossible.
Yeah.
So that was a really encouraging, and Sam and I in the early years were like Googling studies about like what is the effect of neuroplasticity on an infant brain injury, hypoxic brain injury. That's what we found, and we decided to cling with that. And, and then the next question was...
Well, I was going to roll into it if you want to you got to steal it back from. So yeah, talking about that, obviously the younger it is, the better. What is neuroplasticity? We covered that. What's the most effective way to, not necessarily deal with this, but recover these neural pathways to learn how to do things? What did we find that was most effective?
Yeah, like the next question was logically, how do we optimize this?
Exactly.
And
you hear a lot of fancy terms being thrown around of like these different, fancy therapies or, I don't know. Well, I'll let you. Yeah.
You see all this stuff like hyperbaric chambers and red light and traditional PT and OT. And, as a parent, you're like, what is going to get the best outcome? And
everything's got a price tag too.
Of course. But I think fundamentally, the thing that we had heard consistently within the very small community of people who are in this space, and also trusted people, doctors, teams, therapists, is that therapy, good old traditional therapy, is the number one way that you will give your child the best outcome for them to optimize or re-optimize their injury. And that's because of a couple of things. And I think this is a really important thing to address, because I've had a ton of inquiries saying, well, what about red light therapy? What about hyperbaric chamber? It will not yield on its own. We don't put Killian in any of that. We don't. And it's because there's very little evidence to support that is more effective or equally as effective as traditional therapy. And that is because what therapy does is that it introduces consistency in the pattern that is required for them to relearn how to do a task. For example, if we just give Killian a toothbrush, he's not going to know what it is. He's not going to know, okay, the second time we give him a toothbrush and we introduce to brush his teeth, he's going to hate it. I mean, he is going to hate it, and he did hate it for probably about a month or so. And then all of a sudden one day, because we did it every day, and we had the same routine and it was consistency, he now knows that when he is in the bathroom, it's time to brush his teeth. You don't get that with red light. You don't get that with hyperbaric. You only get that with traditional good old-fashioned therapy. And the other thing I want to add is that therapy is based around what is called evidence-based therapy or treatments. And that's basically like people study these outcomes for a living. Like researchers put a bunch of kids with, setbacks, disabilities, developmental delays, they put them in these therapies and they study them. And they're effective. And so they tweak and they perfect and they, and they do what they need to do in order to show that there's a optimal outcome. I only say this point, and we decided to put this in the podcast because there are a bunch of programs that are really expensive, that cost out of pocket. And they will say, oh, it's effective, you should, this is going to help with your brain injury. And I personally would steer clear of any of those claims, mainly because they are primarily motivated by out-of-pocket costs. That's how they run their business. Whereas traditional therapies are motivated by, insurance claims. They have to prove that what they're doing is effective enough to get money.
So to reiterate, just to make sure everybody's tracking, I'm tracking, the evidence-based therapy that we're talking about, that's going to be like your traditional therapies. That's going to be what's covered by insurance. These, as Brynne was mentioning, these fancy programs, maybe not being able to bill insurance for whatever reason it may be. And, obviously, as Brynne mentioned, we haven't put Killian through any of these because, we find value in the evidence-based therapy that we've talked about. If anybody has gone through these programs as well that, has an idea of why they don't necessarily, bill the insurance or why they don't go through that process, whether it be they're doing these innovative therapies that may not necessarily have that backing, so insurance isn't willing to pay. We would love to hear from you. Like, obviously,
put it in the comments.
Absolutely. Like, we're definitely not saying we don't want to even hear about it, shut it down, don't even talk about it. Like, we're open to a discussion about it, obviously, most definitely. But these programs this is where we saw the actual, like, the facts, so
like the hard evidence of, like, if your kid goes through this this system and provide these therapies, and hey, parents, we're also going to educate how you can do this at home. That was, I believe, and we can go into should we go into the intensive therapy talk, because I think that's really I'd like to talk about that.
We'll kind of shift around to our points here that we have, kind of bullet pointed for ourselves. But why don't we talk about the intensive program, since we're kind of on that topic?
Yeah.
And then we can kind of, go from there.
So for those of you who, I had never known what an intensive therapy program was, but essentially for kids who have brain injury, a lot of times these kids will benefit from, a step up from regular therapy, which is already a lot. But basically, these intensive therapies are either all day or half a day, and they're just straight in therapy. They do speech therapy, PT, OT all day. And the kids, Killian loved it, but like a lot of kids really, really hate it because it's like working. It's like kind of, we call it his boot camp.
I called it his part-time job.
Yeah, you called it his part-time job.
Time to go to work, Bubba.
So, they're intensive, which is why they're called that way, but in short bursts. Like, you don't do this all the time because you need the brain to rest and recover and learn. So it's in bursts throughout the year that you do these intensive, rehab programs. And
usually once a year, I think is generally the consensus. But sorry to cut you off. So
there's very few programs in the U.S. who actually provide this kind of intensive therapy. I've gotten a lot of parents reach out that said, the intensive therapy that Killian went through at Kennedy Krieger, was it paid for? And and we were shocked that people were even asking, because then we found out.
Out of pocket paid for, you mean?
Meaning, like, did insurance pay for it?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. And I was interested as to why people were asking. And it turns out a lot of these programs don't bill insurance. So if you are one of those families who have gone through an intensive program that was not billed through insurance, if you could provide the justification or reason as to why that is, because the main reason I want to bring this up is because Kennedy Krieger is not the only program that bills. There are a lot of intensive programs throughout the U.S. that actually bill. They're typically associated with a hospital, a program. So it's really important, and I'm going to have you talk about, 3 things that we should do after a brain injury diagnosis. But, I think it's really important to look at what programs cover intensives, because there is this false understanding that all intensives don't bill, and that's not the case. There actually are a lot. And frankly, I'm not sure why those other, intensive programs choose not to bill. That's a little unclear to me, because I feel like something like that should be billed. I don't know if they're going outside of what insurance will pay for.
Whether the therapy is, again,
non-evidence-based or, whatever. But the structure of our intensive was also very different. Ours was 5 weeks and half a day every day. Whereas these other programs will only be a week, and I think it will be all day. And so there's a lot of different types of intensives, but I want parents to know, when they are looking for intensive programs, know that there are programs that bill insurance.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think we're at a good place that we can transition from 3 things you should know to 3 things you should do, but let's do a quick recap.
Yep.
So 3 things that you should know. Number 1, you should absolutely know what neuroplasticity is and its full potential. Number 2 is that the younger the injury happens, the better. But also, if a task had been learned, it's not impossible for them to relearn how to do that task. And then number 3, the third thing that you should every parent should know is that the most effective form of rehab that's going to optimize that neuroplasticity is good old-fashioned rehab. PT, OT, speech and language, vision, getting that repetition and consistency to allow the brain to relearn how to do something.
Yep.
So those are the three things. I'm sure there's a lot more than that.
The traditional therapy, yep. Mm-hmm.
Traditional therapy. So let's go ahead and switch to three things that every parent should do.
Mm-hmm. So
Sam, kick it off.
So talking about the three things that every parent should do. Number one, understand your insurance. This was a big thing for us. Obviously, going into the situation with Killian and his cardiac condition and everything that we had going on there, we had kind of an insurance plan mapped out already of, I talked to some people that might have some medical experience dealing with a child with a complex issue, and I got guidance from them, and this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. What we found to be most beneficial with these conditions, these chronic conditions, you are going to be in and out of appointments, hospital visits all throughout the year. You will hit your max deductible and you will hit that out-of-pocket maximum, regardless of if you're like on a standard plan or a high deductible plan, talking about a commercial insurance. Guaranteed. We already hit it and it's January. Yeah. So thinking about, do I want the high or the standard? What we found to be most beneficial is going with that high deductible plan, so you can also pair it with an HSA account. Mm-hmm. Using that HSA account, we match the contribution for that total HSA throughout the year to equal the total out-of-pocket maximum for that plan. So for example, $6,000 is our out-of-pocket maximum. We took that $6,000, divided it by 12. That's how much we contribute to our HSA every month. So we know that the most that we're going to pay out of pocket for any insurance costs is going to be automatically covered by our HSA by the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. And we did that because your high deductible plan, the out-of-pocket max is lower than the standard. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like an interesting, you would think like, well, why would you go with high? Well, it's because you're going to meet it. And second of all, your out-of-pocket max is going to be way lower. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a backwards way of thinking of it.
But those standard plans, you don't have the benefit of using an HSA.
Exactly.
So
and using it to what you need.
It's just automatically withdrawn, put into that account. Yeah. You don't even have to think about it. Anytime you have to make a copay or a payment, boom, it's right there. It's already on the HSA. You don't have to worry about budgeting, moving it into a certain account. I mean, I guess you don't have to worry about budgeting, quote unquote. You're doing it, but it's automatic.
Exactly. What's the second thing?
So the second thing that
I guess under the insurance window.
Yes. Oh, good point. So along the lines of insurance. So we're still on point number one here. Mm-hmm. Understanding that there are different ways to bill for this therapy. This was a big one that we didn't even realize until we were about a year and a half of having Killian, and we're already going through all these therapies. As we were kind of mapping out what that intensive program is going to look like, one of my concerns was, well, we're only allotted a certain number of therapy visits per year. So this was a big thing I worked with the coordinator on of like, well, we're only allotted this many therapy visits. We're already using all of these throughout the year. We're getting towards the end of the year. I'm afraid that we're not going to have enough to be able to do this intensive program. Mm-hmm. I found it very important, but I'm worried because, if not, that's going to be out of pocket. Mm-hmm. So talking through, the coordinator at Kennedy Krieger let me know, well, there's different ways that you can bill for these therapy visits. The first one would be habilitative. The second one is rehabilitative. So a therapy office will bill insurance for habilitative therapy when the therapy is being performed in order to learn how to do something essentially for the first time or for an activity that has not been learned yet. So for example, Killian, since his injury happened at such a young age, all of his therapy is being billed habilitative because he's learning how to do things that were never learned and then forgotten. Insurance companies will bill rehabilitative if it's for an activity or something that has been learned and then lost as a result of some sort of injury. So for example, let's say Killian was sitting up and walking on his own, doing all those different types of activities. He had the cardiac arrest, the brain injury as a result, and he's basically relearning how to do these. That would be billed rehabilitative. Mm. So at least with our insurance specifically, and I'm using us as an example because this is obviously what we have experience with, our insurance allots different number therapy counts for each of those individually. So Rehabilitative, we get a certain number of therapy appointments per year. Habilitative appointments are unlimited. So we can have basically as many habilitative therapy appointments as needed for the entire year.
That's amazing.
It's incredible.
Imagine us not like, and we didn't even know this was a thing until we reached out to our case manager, which maybe we should talk about that. Like if you have private insurance, you can actually get a private case manager, so you don't have to go through the phone tree. We were talking to her one time, and she was like, have you guys tried billing like habilitative? And because we were talking about this over the phone.
We were.
And we were like, we didn't even know.
Didn't even know it was a thing.
That was the thing.
And I should have kind of seen some red flags even through the year last year, because, you know, I'm keeping track of his appointments, all of the medical stuff, the insurance, payments, everything. I'm tracking his number of therapy visits, and the number that basically they were telling me how many we've done in that year didn't match what I was seeing on my calendar. Like we had done way more therapy visits according to my calendar than what they were telling me. So internally, I'm kind of like, well, I'm not going to question it if you guys are saying that we're not where I think we are. But that should have been a red flag to me, because, you know, why is that? Well, and that's because some of the offices were billing habilitative, some were billing rehabilitative. Obviously, once we got all the therapists on board, we kind of said, hey, you know, and it wasn't a matter of me saying, I need you to bill habilitative. It was a matter of me saying, hey, I talked to my insurance. They told me that, you know, there's this difference, habilitative, rehabilitative. You know, they feel that Killian falls within that habilitative range, because obviously we're doing therapy to learn how to do things that he hasn't done yet. What are your thoughts? Like, is that something you guys do? Like, and then every single one of his therapists was like, actually, that's a great point. Yeah, let me double check. Some of them were like, oh yeah, he's already being billed rehabilitative, so it's not an issue. There were a few that were like, oh yeah, our office has been billing rehabilitative, and it's been
habilitative.
That was the first one. So
okay.
Now you're messing me up.
Sorry.
Some of them said, oh, we were billing as rehabilitative, which were taking up those number of therapy visits in a year. Let's change that so that's no longer an issue. So
I see. Okay.
Now, I mean, it's been great. We haven't really even had to worry about it. I mean, going into last year, I was super worried, because I'm making his schedule for the week, mapping everything out. And I'm like, gosh, we're going to have to really start limiting these, you know, number of visits. And then, so now it's just kind of like, okay, great. We don't really have to worry about how many, you know, therapy visits have taken place, you know, for the year at that point. So point number 2, Brynne, you want to go ahead and take us away with that?
Yeah. The second thing was talking about getting to an inpatient rehab unit. Now, this was something that was highly recommended to us by the team. Emotionally, this was the last thing that Sam and I wanted to do.
We just want to go home.
At the time, I think we were over 2 months in the ICU. We just had this big traumatic event. This was on top of like 9 months being in the hospital. We were just wanting to go home and be with our baby. But there was a lot of nurses that kind of like pushed us over the edge and said, like, you need to do this because there's a window. And we forgot to talk about this in the above, but we'll talk about it now. But there's a window of a year where you will, after an injury, optimize the most recovery you can. And so they said, hey, like, there's this window, you got to optimize it if you want to give this kid a chance.
Which this window does kind of go hand in hand with that neuroplasticity.
Yes, exactly. I should have put that in the first point, but it's here now. So we said, okay, this is clearly what we had to do. Emotionally, it was, you know, really, really tough, because when you're in the ICU, you're in survival mode. Like you aren't thinking about, how am I emotionally processing this event? And, you know, all of the yucky emotions. So all of that surfaces in a place where you just want to be home. I don't know if you remember this, but I had recently started my job. Yeah. My brand new job, but I was in the ICU in the bathroom, in the private bathroom. That was like my office. And that was just really, really tough.
It was crazy, because you started your brand new job. I was still working full time. Yep. We hadn't been living at home for 3 months. Yeah. Yeah. Basically living out of backpacks, out of a hotel, walking to and from the hospital every day. We're trying to high five and take, you know, work meetings at different times. And
that was rough.
That was the time. Yeah.
That was the time. So anyways, we the things that I would recommend for an inpatient unit is as soon as you get that injury, see what is local or around you. It might mean that you have to travel. It might mean that. However, make sure that your insurance covers it. If not, adjust that with the out-of-pocket max strategy that we used in the beginning of or that we talked about, just a few minutes ago. But get there if you can, and see how many you can be placed on a wait list. We were on a wait list.
We were, and I will say, I'll add a quick point to that. We were obviously recommended we go through the to go to the inpatient rehab facility by everybody on the team, nurses, doctors, neurologists. But what kind of helped us in getting on these wait lists quicker was the fact that after his injury, Killian was assigned a pain management and rehab neurologist specifically, who worked very closely with this inpatient rehab facility. So not only were we getting recommendations from the nurses that were taking care of him day in and day out all day, the doctors, everybody that was involved in the CICU, but also the fact that he was assigned this, as I mentioned, pain management and rehab neurologist, who was kind of like, everybody's already saying this. Absolutely. This, it's an option for sure, but it's a highly encouraged option.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It wasn't just one person. It was many, many people. And so the way that it works is, we talked about that intensive program that Killian was in. This is the in-person or inpatient version of that. And so it's all day therapy. Mm-hmm. And so they work around his nap schedule, but he got speech, PT, OT, and then maybe they sometimes squeezed in another session if it was needed and if we had time. But he was getting therapy all throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And so we were there for close to 2 months. And the progress, apart from us going through our own emotional turmoil of everything, the progress he made there was amazing. I mean, it was like every day he was, and one of the things that I thought, this is the kind of therapy that they did. So based on the MRI scan, they knew that the occipital lobe, which interprets images, colors, puts meaning to, things that the eye is seeing, was hit the hardest. And so what they did is they said, we want this kid to engage with his eyes. We want him to be curious about what he is looking at. If we can get him to be curious, we can then teach him to learn certain things. And so they had a series of toys, that they would use to see what is it that catches his eye? What is it that pulls him out of his brain injury and be curious with the world? So that was step number 1. And then number 2, they said, okay, we get him to engage with shiny things or lights. That's great. But is there a particular color that he's leaning to? So I don't know if you remember this day, but they had a series of the same toy, but with all different colors. And then they watched him try to interact with each one. And then he really leaned heavily towards the red. Mm-hmm. And so it was okay, everything we choose is going to be red. Yeah. Because that's and this is the kind of therapy that they would do to kind of pull him out of his injury. They were literally looking, it's like a wall, like a mountain climber. They were looking at any point of leverage and then seeing where it could take them to the next level. Yep. So it was very, very methodical. Mm-hmm. It was strategic, but we saw so much progress in those 2 months that we were there. So in summary, with this point, as soon as your child gets an injury, ask them about a referral to an inpatient rehab unit, and then get your child on as many lists as you can to see when they would be able to open up.
Yep, absolutely.
But there is a third and final point. Sam, do you want to recap that one?
Yeah, I'll recap the third point, which is make sure you get the right team in place. And what we mean by that is every team or every doctor is going to be different in how they approach situations. So for us, Killian's team, specifically his Kennedy Krieger team, the neurodevelopmental team, they focus a lot, they focus primarily on children with brain injury as a result of cardiac arrest. That's literally puzzle piece fit perfectly. That is exactly the team that Killian needed. And they know how to map out his progress, how to map and just determine what is going to be the best program, what is the best timeline. Is he developing, on obviously his time, but is it according to, trends that they're seeing for other kids that are, in the same category. So, finding and making sure you have that right team set in place.
Mm-hmm.
That is definitely very important. Do you want to expand on that anymore?
Yeah, maybe it would be helpful to name out what specialties, because I get this question a lot on his page about like, who did you look for? Mm-hmm. And so, number one, it really depends on the injury, but who you need leading your case strategy is a neurodevelopmental specialist.
Yes.
Now, we have the good fortune and privilege of living on the East Coast, where these specialized centers are very, very prevalent. This is why we moved back to Maryland, was because of this program. And it happened to just be in the backyard of like where I grew up. But not everybody has access to these kind of programs. Mm-hmm. But if you are able to, find a neurodevelopmental specialist locally or within your area.
Yes.
What they are going to do is, like, I almost liken them to like a ship captain. Like, they're going to kind of lead the strategy of his therapy. They're going to track his progress, but then they're also going to communicate to the teams, like the PT or OT or speech. This is what I'm seeing in terms of his developmental progress. Let's see if we can focus on these areas.
Yeah. A good example of that too is obviously, they're tracking the development from like a cognitive, gross motor, fine motor. But the fact that the MRI and everything was pointing to a lot of damage in the occipital lobe, they immediately pointed to, hey, here's a referral to go see a neuro-ophthalmologist. Let's get his eyes checked out. How's his tracking? As Brynne, as you mentioned, that ship captain or the person kind of leading charge, they're identifying these key areas where a specialist is definitely going to be needed and saying, let's do this right now. They'll kind of lead the charge in that aspect. So it takes a lot of stress off of you as the parent of like sitting down and thinking like, okay, gosh, like, he's got his cardiologist and now his neurodevelopmental specialist, the neurologist. What other doctors do I need to think of? It eliminates the need for that. It's going to basically offload that to them. And they're going to be creating these relationships and establishing care with the specific specialists that your child will need in order to most maximize their recovery.
Yeah, and they also refer to people that they know and trust.
True.
That are specialized in these areas. So, Killian, for example, his occipital lobe was hit the hardest. We immediately saw a vision therapist and then a neuro-ophthalmologist to create a plan to kind of optimize that.
Yeah.
So they, I think neurodevelopmental specialists, if you can remember that term, search for one, because it's going to help you.
Yeah. And within that same point of obviously establishing and making sure you have the right team in place, another thing that I don't think I can emphasize enough that has been super helpful to us is establishing not only with the neurodevelopmental specialist, the neurologist, but also an infants and toddlers team. They are incredible.
Can you talk a little bit about what infants and toddlers is?
Sure. So infants and toddlers is essentially a federal and state funded program where these therapists will come into your home, assess how the child is, performing playtime, eating, speech, everything in your home, and help you be able to identify how you can best nurture that development or make progress in areas that you're kind of hitting a wall in. But they do a great job of just coming and seeing you where you're at and being able to help you kind of go from there. So obviously, the outpatient PT, OT, that's great. That's 100% needed. They don't see you in your home setting. They don't see how you interact with your child on a day-to-day basis, day in and day out. Which obviously, as parents, you're doing the best that you can, but these infants and toddler specialists, and I'll also mention, they're also PT, physical therapists, they're also OTs. They just work in a program that come to your home and help you work at home to be able to identify the best way to, facilitate that growth. So it's
also free.
It's
a free program.
Yeah, I mentioned it at the very beginning, federally and state funded, but it is a free program. Though again, we've lived in states where there was either a very short wait list or we maybe fast-tracked somehow. But I know that when we established care both in Massachusetts when we were in Boston, and then also when we moved back to Maryland. It's a matter of making a phone call. I think it was as simple as we Googled infants and toddlers and then the state. So you'll get in contact with them. They'll schedule you out. They'll tell you how long it can be until somebody can come out and see them. They'll do an assessment and then kind of set you up with the correct therapist that we'll be able to best facilitate that growth and development at home.
The other thing I love about this particular program is, Sam, you mentioned how, they work with, you have your outpatient therapist. So the big question is, oh my gosh, now are there too many chefs in the kitchen? Like, are there too many eyes and hands on Killian? And how do we make that cohesive? And his team, they get a recap of like, okay, where's Killian? What are you guys working on? Let's update, me. And then, here's like the midterm between, because you don't even also see outpatient therapists, like sometimes it's every other week. And so, especially with eating, you have these like highs and lows. So they're really helpful to come in once a week and just say like, they're like in between therapists of like, hey, I'm really struggling. Like Killian's he's had a really bad like 3 eating days. Like, can you come in and just give him a really good session? And we love our infants and toddlers, their speech therapist and PT and OT, but she'll come in and just give him like a solid eating session to stick with the example. And then, it kind of puts Killian back on track. And so what they do is, what I'm trying to say is, there's no conflicting. They all work with each other based on the same plan. So, and it's really, they say like, what do you prefer? Do you want us to lead, or do you want your outpatient therapist to lead? And then we choose. And we chose outpatient because it's led by the neurodevelopmental specialist. And she does her assessments and, really keeps Killian on track. And they were like, perfect, we'll just plug into that.
Yep. Basically, hey, give us an update from your last appointment. Where's he at? Where do you want him to be? What's your goals there? And then they set their goals to basically match and mirror your outpatient and, primary care team.
Now, before we move on to the last two, closing questions that we get about Killian's brain injury in the early stages, I want to talk about, if you are a listener and you have access issues, we want to hear why that is the case. Like what is it about, the situation that you can't get access? Is it a long waiting list? Because this is something that a lot of parents have expressed, and we just want to become more familiar to see how we can provide, innovative solutions to, common access issues. Just because we have been able to navigate some of this landscape, and there might be reasonable solutions or not. It could just be, a lot of friends from Texas, which is a huge state, reach out and they say like, early intervention is great. Infants and toddlers is great. It's the same program. They're used interchangeably, but we've been on the wait list for 9 months and we haven't gotten an evaluation. That could very well be the case because of the size of the state. And so you only have so many therapists based on the funding that they get. And we would love to know the problems, especially because, as we've talked about, we run a nonprofit on the side. So if there's advocacy that we could, try to expand access in certain areas, we would love to know that, to see if we could play a part in being able to expand that access. So,
absolutely. Just because this is our experience and, some areas were easier than others for us, that obviously isn't the case for everybody. So we would love to hear from you. Yeah.
So put it in the comments. But we did have, the two other last common questions that we get. Okay. So before we move on to that, I guess I'll do a recap, right? We talked about 3 things that you should know. We then, talked about 3 things you should do. And the 3 things that you should do is understand your insurance, understand the difference between habilitative and rehabilitative, understand how to modulate your insurance plan that fits your medical needs the best way that it can. Number 2 is to absolutely advocate from day 1 to get placed on a wait list to get into an inpatient rehab unit. That is going to optimize the 1-year neuroplasticity window that is always present in these infants. And then number 3 is to make sure that you get the right team in place. Try to find a neurodevelopmental specialist, look into infants and toddlers or early intervention, and then get plugged into an outpatient PT, OT facility as fast as you can to make sure that you're optimizing the success. But we do have 2 final questions. These are the 2 questions we get asked the most. So, Sam, I'm going to ask you how you would respond to this. But what do you say to a family? How do you encourage a family who has a recent brain injury diagnosis?
That's gosh. I wish it was like super easy to answer that, but I think
I gave you the tough question.
You did give me the tough one. I feel like that's cheating. That's not fair. What to say to a family that has been diagnosed or how to encourage them? Well, for example, you know of somebody that this happened to, so you're interacting with, the mom and dad of a child who, is going through this. I think the best thing that you could not do, I'll say that, is, at least me personally, I know we've talked about this, talking to another person or another couple that may try to say, oh, I know exactly what you're going through because of X, Y, and Z, or because, I had this, I can understand how you might think that would be helpful to say to somebody of like, oh yeah, you just got this diagnosis or this just happened to you. You're okay because this happened to me and I'm okay. Mm-hmm. I can understand the thought process with that, but I will say, as a parent who went through this, that is the last thing that I want to hear is how you got through something that is either maybe kind of similar or not really similar or just way off, it's not helpful. Yeah. In moments like this, it's okay to just say, I'm sorry. It's okay to just say, how can I pray for you? It's okay to just say, I love you and I'm thinking about you. Mm-hmm. It's even okay to say, let me know if you need anything. Or, if you might know that, this couple or these parents that are going through this might enjoy doing something or an activity, like it's okay to just say, hey, I'm really sorry. I'm going to pay for you guys to go out to dinner. Or it's okay. You don't always have to relate is the point that I'm trying to make. That I think for us and many other parents that we've talked to that have been through something like this, the incessant need to feel like people relate to what you're what you're going through it's very frustrating. It's a very frustrating thing to happen. And obviously you don't want to frustrate them, Again, I understand why it's done, but it's not always the best thing to do.
I think at the long of the short of it, it makes you feel not seen. It makes you feel like your pain is like just being overlooked. And so gearing conversation, around, hey, no one should, my best friend Caroline was so instrumental, and she had never walked through, this path, but she would say things like, no one should go through this. This is a really sucky time for you. Mm-hmm. And I am so sorry. And she would just speak to my pain. She wouldn't try to relate to it. She wouldn't try to overlook it. She just spoke to it. And so I totally agree with what you're saying. The other thing is when people said, what is one thing you need today? What is one thing? Mm. And I would say, because when people say like, let me know if I can do anything, it's like, okay, well, if I ask you, can you pay for my dinner? Like that makes me feel icky. Yeah. But I could really use a paid dinner right now because we have like $20 left in our account and we're sick of hospital food.
Or, hey, I haven't went to the barber or the salon in 5 months because I just don't have time.
And don't ask. Just give the gift card. Just say, hey, I Venmo'd you $150. I want you to go get your nails done. I want you to go get your hair done. Just go do it.
And this is obviously going into it, with the anticipation of you want to help them. Like we're not saying do this without you feeling, convicted or kind of led to help in some way. Like we're not just saying go donate money to the nearest CHD family that you see. Right. Just if you're feeling, that desire, or if you're feeling led to do that type of thing, it's better to just do rather than say, how can I help, and wait for them to kind of say so. It's
at almost like your friend Frank, who was like every now and then he would just like, Venmo you $25 and he's like, hey, go on a date. Mm-hmm. Like, take Brynne out on a date or something like that. Like we didn't ask, he didn't ask.
That it means so much. And gosh, I can't even put it into words. Being that you talk about not feeling seen when other people try to relate to you, that made us feel seen. That made us feel loved. Even though we don't have the time to sit and call and talk to these people that we truly and dearly love every single day, but you just feel seen, that like they know that what you're going through is so tough, and without even, trying to bother you or, they're just,
The other thing that I think I think the point that you enforced is so important.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that was super helpful is that my crew of people helped me, especially you, focus on the things that we can do and then go from there.
Yeah.
I remember it was like 2 weeks after his cardiac arrest, he had finally started to like wake up from, seizures and sedation and stuff like that. We didn't know what to do. I mean, you couldn't even touch the kid without him screaming out in pain. I mean, like, talk about like I can't even comfort my own baby now. Like, what's my role? But you encouraged me to create like a chart of, okay, if we're going to work on skin to skin, if we're going to work on like you being okay if I touch your arm or I touch your face, that's what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to work on lifting up your heels to make sure that they're stretched, that's what we're going to do. If we're going to work on, if I can't touch you, or if you've been sensoried out because of your injury, let's listen to music.
Mm-hmm.
And you start with the smallest of steps and focus on just succeeding in that. It's a lot like, climbing a mountain, and you're climbing and you're climbing and you're climbing, and then the cardiac arrest happens and you're like, okay, how much more do I have to climb? And you look up and it's like a whole nother mountain.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it's like. But if you keep your eyes on your feet, you will go farther than just looking up at how much you have left to go.
Mm-hmm.
So start with like what I did. Do you remember the whiteboard?
I do.
Yeah, we still have it. But what we did is we created like a schedule, like Monday, Tuesday, 7 days a week, morning and evening. These were the things that we worked on. And we literally made a schedule. And they were, if we looked back on what we were working on, it was like, I want him to look at me for 2 seconds without breaking eye contact.
Mm-hmm.
I want him to be able to have my hand hold him for 5 seconds without him scream. And then look at him now. It's like, did I think we would ever be here? No, but it started, with what can I control? What can
very
I
small
do?
goals. Yeah.
Small goals. And it encouraged them to focus on that.
Yep.
And then I think we have...
So the last point, since you led with me, so I'll ask you the second question here that we get asked a lot. So I'm going to ask you the next question here. So, Brynne, what are some tips for mental toughness regarding brain injury?
Ooh. See, this one's also a hard one.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things you could say and do. But I think the biggest thing is to consider it a marathon, not a sprint.
Mm-hmm.
This is not something, there's no one fix. It's not like you get him an inpatient and he's going to do marginally better. It's not like, oh, I, put him in intensive therapy and now he can walk.
Yeah.
This is something that you are going to deal with for the rest of your life. Part of that is your own path of acceptance, and grief takes a while.
Mm-hmm.
It takes you a while to get to the point of accepting this as your reality. That's just humanity. That's just you being given something that no human should ever learn how to accept, and you having to find the strength to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't happen overnight. And so there's a period of time where you grieve. So allow yourself to grieve. Allow yourself to feel the icky emotions. Allow yourself to go through those processes to get to a point of acceptance. Don't suppress it. I'm a former mental health therapist. I will tell you, the worst thing that you can do is try to pretend that these feelings aren't here, to try and suppress them, because you will deal with them twice as long than just dealing with it. So let the grief take place, but then in that path of acceptance, you're also going to realize that this is a lifetime thing.
Mm-hmm.
And your goal as a parent is to optimize what life looks like for your little one with a brain injury. That's your job.
Yeah.
That's like the goal. That does not happen overnight. It doesn't happen with one treatment. It will be a life change and a life fix. And so if you perceive it that way, of like, I'm gearing up for a marathon and not a sprint, it will help you with the ups and the downs. The second thing is consistency. You're going to have really bad days.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have days where it was like he didn't want to do anything. He didn't want to eat. He didn't want to roll over. He didn't want to do therapy.
He didn't even want to be held.
Yeah.
He's
unhappy when I put it. And part of that is he's a normal toddler, which is great. But the other half of it is that is, which is also, yes, he is a normal toddler, but he also is not a normal toddler. So,
yes.
When people say like, oh, that's just him being a kid. It's like, yes, it's him being a kid times like 10 more responsibilities of like layered on top of that.
Yeah.
But when you have those really bad days, just know that you're also going to have really high days. I mean, there were, when he has these developmental peaks, like he will eat like 30 to 40 mLs of food every meal. And then guess what? Next week, he's back at not wanting to eat.
Yeah.
Or
those moments where you get up and you stand up to walk out of the room and he turns and looks at you and waves at you for the first time.
Yeah.
And you're like, what in the world was that?
Yeah.
When did he learn that?
Yeah.
So these moments of just like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Look at all this progress are also met with the very low valleys of what am I doing wrong?
Yeah. And am I doing enough?
Yes.
Chances are if you're even listening to this podcast, it's because you are doing above and beyond what any parent would, what any child would hope that their parent would do for them.
100%. Yeah.
And so just remember that. You guys are crushing it. And it's a marathon. Let yourself grieve and then learn to accept the new reality because it could end up being a lot more beautiful than you think it would be. And that's all we have for you guys.
It is,
Sam,
yeah.
do you have anything?
No, I think we talked about a lot. It's funny. We went into this saying, oh, this will be a quick episode. We'll be done in 30 minutes. Here we are at about an hour. I don't know what the actual finished recording time is going to be, but a lot of content there, a lot of good stuff. But we'd love to hear from you. I know we've mentioned that throughout. This will be on multiple platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Feel free to obviously contact us via DM on Instagram. You can leave comments on the YouTube version of the podcast here. But yeah, feel free to leave your thoughts, comments, suggestions,
And follow us at The Beautifully Rare Life on Instagram. This is where we'll have podcast clips. You'll be able to interact and ask questions in the videos. But thank you again. We are so happy that you have chosen to spend some time with us. And join us next time where we talk about how to strengthen your marriage through adversity.
It's going to be a fun one.
It's going to be a fun one. Buckle up. See you guys next time.
All right. Bye.